Okay, so for those of you who don't know, I'm Eleanor Sandry, and I work in the Department of Internet Studies at Curtin. And so I teach Internet Studies, but my research is actually about communication more generally, so not just communication online, although broadly it's about communication and technology, so human communication with technology and through technology. But I'm also quite interested in human-animal communication as well. So anything that involves humans communicating with other than humans interests me. So the presentation that I'm giving today actually came out of a review that I got for an article that I have had published in Philosophy and Technology. So the reviewer said to me that they understood why I couldn't talk about agency too much within my paper because there just wasn't space. I was talking mainly about communication with robots. But they would be really interested to read something about agency. So I took up the challenge and I wrote this for ICA. So this is actually a presentation that I did for ICA, but I'm going to present it in a much more relaxed fashion because I had to do it in 12 minutes at ICA and it was a bit of a nightmare. So I should have enough time to kind of say a little bit more about the interactions that you're going to see on the screen and the people that I'm talking about, basically. So my aim in writing this was to try to examine how communication theory and also philosophical approaches to human-robot interactions offered ways to recognize the agency of machines in interaction, but also to continue to acknowledge the fact that they have an absolute alterity. Okay, there are elements about them which may seem human-like, but they are definitely not human, and it's really important to remember that. So people anthropomorphise pretty much anything. Like they anthropomorphise their computers, you know, we shout at them when they do something wrong, we give our cars names, people named bombs, all sorts of things. You know, there's all sorts of examples of people anthropomorphizing objects, but also machines, and particularly robots. So robots which they're interacting with, they're very likely to be anthropomorphized because people are trying to develop an understanding of what the machine is doing. But alongside this, kind of my whole idea behind all of my research pretty much is that it's really important to negotiate the understandings that you may have of the machine's agency so that you continually remember that it's other than human. Because really, I'm not interested in people creating machines that are designed to replace humans. I'm interested in people creating machines that actually operate with humans, that collaborate with humans, that we can collaborate with, that actually extend or augment our life in interesting ways. So this research is going to talk about some agency of machines during the creation of the machine and also in interactions afterwards, so in what you're actually doing with the machine. Okay, and it uses art examples because art examples are cool and they're very photogenic. But what I'm actually looking at doing is extending this into considerations of human relations with self-driving vehicles, so human relations with autonomous cars, which are basically robots on wheels that you travel in. Social robots, the sorts of things that people are now selling to be in your home or in your workplace, that you're going to interact with. It's going to be some form of personal assistant for you. And also care and assistive robots, so the sorts of robots that we're beginning to see people talking about introducing to hospitals, to care homes. We're actually seeing some of them introduced already, but there's a lot more on the way. And considering why it's important to be able to relate to that machine somehow, you need to recognize its agency somehow so you have trust in it, that it's going to do its job, but also that maybe it's important to remember that it's other than human. So let's look at the art robots. So I met Jessica Field in 2007. So this is how long this bit of research has been waiting to come. And it was interesting because I didn't even know I was going to meet Jessica Field. I was actually in Montreal to visit someone called Bill Vaughan, who was a roboticist who had a very different take on how to design robots. And he suggested that I went to see Jessica. So Jessica Field was, when I went to see her, involved in creating something called field studies. And she was creating basically the robots that you see pictured here, and also there was another one as well. But basically, she was explaining to me how she develops these robots, and she also explains this on her website. Because she's developing robots that, in a way that provides a latitude for their behaviors and choices. which sounds quite strange. They can demonstrate independence and behave on their own. So when Field's designing and developing a robot, she's kind of building it in a kind of a collaboration with the robot itself. She sees what the robot can do, and then she works with that. So she notes that there's always a kind of a compromise when she's creating these machines, a sort of a dialogue. She needs to continually find ways to work around the machine's architecture. Field argues that she gains an understanding of the robot, and she then tries to reflect this as a kind of identity for the robot. And she's always trying to create robots that have behaviors that are somehow familiar. So you kind of have a sense that they're somehow like an animal, and yet they're also truly unfamiliar as well. So it's clearly an artificial life form. And you can kind of see here that these different robots, I mean, they're quite obviously machines, but the way that they move, if you get to see them moving around, which not that many people did, but I did. So one of them's a line-following robot, and they do things like flashing lights, and they've got these fiber optic lamp things that come out of them, and they're really quite entertaining little creatures, which are kind of like animals, but they're obviously also not animals. So her goal is to make the robots appear as if they're somehow conscious, but also making it blatantly apparent through their physicality that they're not conscious at all. They're just little machines. And she develops a dialogue while she's working around or working with the machine. And everything that she says about them draws attention to an idea of zoomorphism. So even she thinks about them a bit like animals when she's actually working with them. But it's tempered by the sense of it being a very unfamiliar artificial life form, if it's a life form at all. So there's inverted commas kind of around that. So everything that Jessica Field says about creating her robots actually resonates with a philosopher, Andrew Pickering's description of ideas about tuning in goal-oriented practice. So Pickering is actually not talking about robots, he's not talking about art, he's talking about the interplay of agency that occurs between scientists and the instruments that they use when they're doing their research. So he talks about how the very design of an experiment is not only affected by the goals and orientations of the scientists, but also by the technology that they're trying to use in completing that experiment. And so he talks about this idea of tuning, and he argues that that takes the form of a dance of agency. And the dance involves a dialectic of resistance and accommodation from the perspective of the human. If you like, a kind of a negotiation of what's technically possible, what they want to achieve, and ways of working around that. So you end up with revisions occurring not only to the material form of the machine, so in this case to the form of these machines that Field creates, and the human frame of gestures and social relations that surround it. So the way that Field actually talks to the robots, if you like, or writes about them, or tries to create the artwork around them, but also to the goals and intentions of the humans, so the things that Field is actually trying to do with these machines in creating an artwork. And you can see then that Field is working with the possibilities of the robots, and she's embracing what might be called bugs, so the problems that she has, as novel behaviours, and then she kind of builds on those. And she kind of purposely makes it really easy to put bugs into these machines, because she forces herself to program in assembler. And if you've ever done programming, you will know that assembler is not the easiest language to program in at all, and it's really easy to make errors. And she's kind of playing on that fact, that she's going to make errors, and then she sees what the robot does, and then she tries to work it into the way that she sees its individual identity coming out. So Francois Courren, who's a communication theorist, actually he works in organisational communication, so it's really interesting that you can apply some of his ideas here. He extends the work of Pickering to suggest that whenever you can identify someone or something that makes a difference, so makes a difference in the world, whether in terms of activity or performance, then there is action and agency. The decision to attribute activity and performance verbs to non-humans, Courren argues, need not be taken to indicate that the activities or performances of non-humans are like those performed by humans. So he's really insistent that there is a difference, but that these machines are nonetheless active in the world. Attributing agency to materiality or to machines does not amount to dispossessing humans from their strategies, their intentionality, their goal-oriented practices, or even their wit. So he's really trying to defend his ideas here against people who are always wanting to think of the human as being at the center of everything. What he's trying to suggest is that you can step aside from that, and without taking away from the human, you can look at what other things offer as active agents in the world. So he says that the recognition that action and agency are not human beings' privileges allows us to decenter our analyses and show that people are acted upon as much as they act. Now, I would argue that, in fact, when you're looking at a particular interaction or a particular context, it's really important to note that there's an asymmetry of relation. So it can move either way. So sometimes people act more on the technology, and sometimes the technology acts more on the people. It just depends what's happening and where the control in that relationship lies at that particular moment in time. Describing the actions of robots in words commonly used only to refer to humans can be contentious, very contentious in my experience, and there's quite often questions raised by reviewers of journal articles depending on where I'm trying to publish. But in considering the term action, Coren draws attention to the way that commonplace understandings of that term and the things that come, action verbs, if you like, often do not make explicit reference to the idea of intention, because intention is often the question that people raise. They're often uncomfortable with the idea that there's any intentionality in the machine. And so although philosophers and some scholars argue that sometimes action, to be active, if you like, you have to have intention. In fact, it's not necessary to do that. And for me, that's kind of summed up in the things that I've put at the bottom of this slide. So the idea that the unintentional may not be inconsequential within a particular context or human-machine relation. And in the moment or during the process of interaction, it can actually be really difficult not to consider the activity of machines as intentional, because what you will tend to do is to read something into them. And that's an anthropomorphic response that's almost impossible to overcome or overlook. And in fact, that anthropomorphic response, which some people are really worried about, like we shouldn't have that kind of response to machines, but I would say that that's actually really helpful sometimes, because it helps you attend to the consequences of the actions of the machine more carefully. And attending to the consequences of what the machine does may be really important. Say if you're in a self-driving car, it may be really important. Okay, so that's activity and agency during the creation of machines. My second example is of an artist's collaboration with a robot. So Sugwen Chung created Drawing Operations Unit Generation 1 with someone else who actually designed and built the robot for her. And she explains that working with Doug1, which is the shortening of that very long name, allows her to experiment with a new form of drawing. Okay? It involves slowing down and paying attention to the robot. Although Doug1's agency might be questioned, Doug1 tracks her movements as she draws and then draws with her. The tracking action is mutual, because Chung responds to the robot as it draws the line, and the robot responds to Chung as well. Chung describes Doug1 as a mechanical agent. She's not afraid to do that, whose errors and distortions resulting from its lack of motor dexterity, because it's not as good at drawing as she is, which might have been really aggravating when you think about it, because she's quite a perfectionist in the way that she draws, or has drawn in the past. But she says that the lack of precision or perfection that occurs within the drawings alters the way that the project develops, and she thinks it's delightful and surprising. So she's learned something by actually drawing with this robot. Chung notes that the robot's physical form is powerful. It's kind of a mechanical arm, but it's very, very simple, but the way that it moves with her is quite a powerful feeling as she's drawing with it. And it's combined, so this physical form of a kind of an arm with a pen is combined with computer vision and an algorithm to generate movement. So it's really easy for her and for viewers of them drawing together to assign agency, personality, and intent to this machine. Chung recognizes that this is a form of anthropomorphism, but I would suggest that her response to this machine is tempered in a similar way to Field's response, because Doug1 is so obviously a machine and not actually a human. Okay, so the process of working with Doug1 relies on communicating entirely through gesture. So as the video shows, what's happening is they are drawing precisely together, so the interaction is occurring in the same space at the same time, and they kind of move around each other. And this type of embodied communication is something that theorist Donna Haraway has noted is more like a dance than a word. So it's not like talking to transmit information or exchange information. It's very much built around the movement as the machine and the human move together. Haraway, in saying this about embodied communication, draws on the work of Stuart Shanker and Barbara King, who suggest that communication framed by the dance metaphor, which this is an example of, involves co-regulated interactions and the emergence of creative communication behaviours within that context. So what happens is that you're not communicating directly, as in you're not transmitting information, but you are still communicating because of the way that all of your movements are tailored around what the other, in this case a machine, is doing. So you're tailoring your movement to one another. Okay. So Pickering emphasises that his theories about agency not only try to keep both human and non-human agency in view at the same time, which is what this kind of embodied idea of communication does, but also insist on the constitutive intertwining and reciprocal interdefinition of human and material agency. So what you see in a relationship like this, particularly if you're watching it or if you're involved in it, is that the idea of the agency of the machine kind of comes to light through the interaction itself. So these concepts, co-regulation, intertwining, and interdefinition, suggest that the embodied communication between Chung and Doug One is closely connected with the way that Doug One's non-human agency can be understood as emerging within that process of interaction. Pickering notes that his way of understanding the interconnection of human and material agency is essentially temporal. And so you can see here that it's not only framed by a dance metaphor that's occurring in physical space, but also that the timing of that, so the actual being in the interaction, is really important. And if you watch videos of Chung, I think it's really funny the way that, so she talks about the agency of the robot a lot, but also then you see her, so when they start drawing and the robot's pen isn't in the right place, she just literally reaches out and like plonks the pen down on the paper. And when she finishes, she reaches out and she grabs the pen and takes it away from the robot. So there's this sense of agency in the machine while you're actually in the interaction, but there's also a really strong understanding that it is a machine that you are working with and that you basically kind of have the right to just take its pen away. Okay, so it's quite an interesting type of relation, and it's important to recognize that Doug's alterations of the drawing are not really intentional. So this isn't that intelligent a machine. It's not really an artificial intelligence. They're, in a way, associated with its mechanical limitations. But the robot can be understood as an agent within the drawing process because of the attention that Chung pays to its activity in the world. So because Chung pays attention to the robot, that's kind of where its agency comes from in this process. The non-human agency of the machine in this case is a continual presence, even as its human collaborator anthropomorphizes its ability to draw with her. So it's still very non-human. So this type of anthropomorphic response to robots can be linked with Coren's insistence that the interactional scene should open itself up to the agency of other figures that speak through us, the human beings. And so you kind of see Doug One speaking through Sugwon here. But I would say that if this robot was seen by Chung as a malfunctioning machine, so if she noticed its bugs, if you like, if she noticed its difficulty drawing as something that was detracting from the process, a tool that doesn't work as well as it could, as opposed to this mechanical agent that she's willing to negotiate with to kind of encompass its drawing difficulties within what she's doing, then I don't think they would produce the work that they do, and I don't think, in fact, that the collaboration would take place at all. So her response to the machine is really important here. Okay, so Coren contends that we need to recognize that non-human agency is irreducible to human agency. And this is really why I bother to go to do what John hates me doing, which is to talk about philosophy and to look at phenomenology. And this is probably the in spite of the fact that I've kind of written a book about this, is probably the first time that I've really tried to lay it out for people. Why do I bother to try to extend Levinas's theory of the face-to-face to human-robot interactions? The face-to-face doesn't require the presence of physical human faces, although Levinas only considered humans himself. Many people now, me included, have argued that it's not necessarily a human that has to be involved in this type of interaction. But my reasons specifically for looking at Levinas and thinking about Levinas in terms of these interactions is mainly, I have three reasons, but mainly because Levinas's primary concern is to retain this idea of the absolute alterity of the other. So even as self and other are drawn into the proximity of an encounter, so even as Sugwen Chung and Doug Won draw together, they nonetheless are in this encounter, which even for observers, the absolute alterity of Doug Won, so the idea that Doug Won is somehow managing to interact with a human but is non-human, is really clear. So Doug Won always retains its absolute alterity, even as Chung anthropomorphizes its movements, or maybe people do when they're watching it as well. Second, Levinas's theorization of the self-other encounter, in particular when it's explored by Blanchot, suggests that the encounter with the other not only constitutes an interruption in being, so not only are you drawn to understand that the other here is very much a machine with different abilities, capabilities from a human, but also it provides an opportunity for the machine to interrupt the self, the self's communication, so to bring something new to the interaction. So Doug Won does sometimes experience technical difficulties during a drawing performance and may respond to Chung's movements in unexpected ways, bringing an idea of interruption to the fore, because as soon as it does something unexpected, Chung will notice that because she's very much in this interaction and will then respond to that interruption. So Chung's anthropomorphic response is disrupted, so the sense of being of this machine is disrupted by the way it appears, but also the way that it's active, that its agency in the world also becomes a part of the improvisation itself, if you like. So the inaccuracies of Doug's drawing become part of that improvisation. And third, Levinas's ethics of the face-to-face requires the human self to respond to the other, in this case the machine other. And this does not mean treating the machine other as if it were human, but rather responding to and respecting the machine for its particular non-human abilities in the interaction. So sometimes machines respond very visibly to their human partners, and there's lots of examples of this now, which I want to talk about within social robotics in the future. And Doug Won does that to an extent as well, because Doug Won's kind of following the drawing process that Sugwen goes through. But these machines rarely reciprocate on equal terms. Okay, so there's a definite asymmetry in the way that communication occurs in these relations and in the way that response occurs. And this is the other reason that Levinas's theory is really useful, because Levinas's conception of the face-to-face does not require an interaction to be reciprocal. Levinas is open to the idea that the other may not reciprocate at all, and it may all be on the human side, or you may see that there is some reciprocation, or it may change, so the asymmetry of the relation may change as the interaction occurs. So Doug Won interrupts the drawing process of the human, suggesting new paths, and the acceptance of these is supported by Chung's respect for that particular robot and for the fact that she's interacting with it, and her willingness to adapt to its movements throughout the interaction. So there's a full written paper that goes with this that was available at ICA, and I will be altering it and writing it up for publication somewhere, maybe in Philosophy and Technology, maybe somewhere else. And in the full written paper, I've included some other examples, which I've actually written about before, but some more practical examples. So things like the way that people collaborate with their robotic vacuum cleaners, or in fact the way that the people who collaborate with their robotic vacuum cleaners have cleaner houses than the ones who get really frustrated with their robotic vacuum cleaner not doing what they wanted to do. And now I'm interested in kind of spreading these ideas further, so looking at some self-driving cars and things as well. And there's lots of ways that I'm going to take this. So the main argument of the paper is that recognizing the non-human agency of machines is an essential part of actually developing a kind of a meaningful or productive relationship with them. Machines can and are likely to be, and maybe even should be regarded as non-human agents. But this occurs alongside this, their non-humanness, their alterity must be kept in mind, both in order to notice when they can add value to a collaboration. So by doing something that's entirely not, it's not a human ability, it's a machine ability. But also as a reminder that human responses to their agency should be different from human responses to other humans. And that's really important in philosophy and ethics at the moment, where people are trying to make arguments about whether or not robots should have rights and how people should respond to robots and the effects that that has. And so this idea of them being non-human agents and trying to work around, well, is agent the right word for them? I've been asked that as well, and I'm a bit like, well, what other word are we going to use for them? Because it's used a lot within technical language. You often talk about agents within software systems as much as within hardware systems. So it's a very difficult word to get away from. So you kind of need to find new ways of actually theorizing these relations. And that is the end of what I wanted to say. Thank you very much.